Almost from the very beginnings of psychology, we've been interested in measuring and understanding intelligence. For decades, psychologists have worked on tools to evaluate a person's mind, to predict which children will be gifted, to find out where we are in the pecking order of humanity. We'd all very much like to know where we stand in that order. Are we, as a species, the smartest of them all? Within our own species, how does each one of us stack up? And if we don't fare well in that comparison, what do we need to do to our brains to improve our lot? So far, intelligence remains not only hard to measure, but more importantly, next to impossible to define. Yet, many of us walk around intuitively believing that the answer is as simple as the bigger your brain, the smarter you are. Is that true? Does a bigger brain make a person more intelligent? What about a species? Well, there is a moderate correlation between human brain size and many measures of intelligence. That is, the bigger a person's brain, the better they'll perform on average on IQ tests. But this correlation is only moderate, and there are many other factors to consider, nuances that make this particular story much more interesting. Take the fact that, compared with many other species, humans are born with fairly small brains, leaving infants pretty much defenseless and unable to survive without a lot of care and attention, at least for the first year. Wouldn't it make more sense, from the perspective of our chances of surviving long enough to reproduce, if we were born with more developed brains, making us at least capable of feeding ourselves, if not avoiding being eaten? Isn't it dangerous, from an evolutionary point of view, to give birth to such pitifully incompetent, not to mention incontinent, babies? To explain this conundrum, many people point to what's called the obstetrical dilemma, the problem that walking upright supposedly created. A long-held idea is that during our evolution, there was a selection pressure for a smaller pelvis to help us walk upright, which was then at odds with the selection pressure to house a bigger brain in newborns, whose heads, of course, have to pass through a woman's pelvis. The smaller the pelvis, the better able we are to walk, but the smaller the opening for a baby's head. This dilemma is used to explain why human babies are born rather underdeveloped, why the first 3 months postpartum are often called the fourth trimester, referring to the fact that newborns are not much different than a meatloaf. A cute one, but not a very functional one for sure. This explanation also purports to tell us why brain size triples in the first year, and why the skull of a newborn has soft spots and cracks in it, enabling it to fold and squeeze through a small birth canal without damaging the brain encased within it, but of course, leaving the baby vulnerable to grave injury until the skull closes and toughens up. It's a compelling idea, but new research is calling this view into question. It turns out that compared to other primates, our babies aren't really born prematurely. Other primate infants are also pretty dependent on their parents for a while after birth. And there's no evidence that a larger pelvis in women would interfere with walking anyway, or any of the other things we use our pelvis for. So if it really was just about bigger brains, mothers would just develop wider hips. But of course, the story of brain development is much more complicated than that. Instead, evidence is mounting that our gestation time is limited by the amount of food that a mother can supply to herself and her baby when she's pregnant, and around the 40-week mark, this limit is reached. She simply can't get enough energy from food to fuel a growing baby and herself. I've often had the experience of wanting to yell at my computer when I read a blog post or other article explaining that men are smarter than women because they have bigger brains. There are several problems with this assertion, but even the newborn brain argues against it. Did you know that the brains of full-term newborn girls are no smaller than those of full-term newborn boys? So if they start out with the same size brains, what changes as they mature? Now, my son is no slouch, and yet his toddler girlfriends beat him at virtually every developmental milestone. So it's not like his brain is necessarily growing faster than theirs, but the rest of his body sure seems to be. What's more, if you stand behind the bigger the brain, the bigger the intelligence argument, then you're going to have to concede the prize for most intelligent animal to whales, with elephants not far behind. Well, now, you might be thinking, what I meant was brain size taking into account body size. What we quantify is the ratio of brain size to body size. In that case, sure, humans clock in at about 1 to 40. Our brains take up about 2% of our body mass, which sounds pretty good until you realize that it's the same ratio as a mouse. Small birds do us one better, at 1 to 14. But the tiny ant, which, if you've ever had an infestation in your house, might actually have won your respect, has a massive brain compared with its body size, with a ratio of 1 to 7. The hippopotamus, by the way, does not fare well in this comparison, poor thing. And cats beat out dogs. Go figure. Oh, and my toddler has a bigger ratio than I do, which might explain why he can already outwit me, among other things. So now we get to a number that might in fact matter, the encephalization quotient. This is the ratio of actual brain mass over the expected brain mass of an organism with the same body mass. That is, the ratio takes into account the fact that bigger bodies are expected to house bigger brains. But our brains are quite a bit bigger than the brains of other mammals who are about the same size. Now the lowly mouse looks fairly stupid, and humans do come out on top, beating out the dolphins, whales, and elephants by a fair margin. And here, dogs fare better than cats, naturally. Orca whales, which are considered to be quite intelligent, have about the same EQ as chimpanzees. And there's a correlation with scoring high on EQ and living in a larger social group. Among cetaceans, for example, social species like orcas and dolphins have higher EQs than more solitary species. That might also explain the difference in EQ between dogs, who are more social overall, and socially aloof cats. Okay, so maybe the encephalization quotient points to some correlation between brain size and intelligence, and makes us humans stand out. We'll come back to this ratio once we consider the question that is really at the heart of the matter. Does that mean that within a species, a bigger brain means a smarter individual? Are taller people more intelligent than shorter ones because on average their brains are bigger? It's a complicated question, so for the moment let's set aside the notion that a larger brain signals greater intelligence, and let's look at an even more fundamental question. Let's consider what it is that we're actually looking for when we measure intelligence. Let's assume for a moment that humans represent the epitome of cognitive sophistication, that what gives humans the keys to the kingdom of Earth is the complexity of our minds. But when we try to define what exactly cognitive sophistication means and how it might make a person more or less successful, things get hard. Take, for example, the notion that there even exists some kind of measurable general intelligence. Figuring out what it is and whether and how it can be developed or enhanced is a billion-dollar question. And so it's no surprise that psychologists have been trying to answer it for decades. The G factor, G for general, is what many psychologists have spent entire careers searching for. The idea is that there is a common factor that correlates with performance on a wide array of tests of cognitive abilities. If someone is very good at math, they are also likely to do well on other tests of intelligence, like vocabulary, reading comprehension, manipulating shapes in their mind's eye, and so on. And there's a fair amount of evidence supporting this idea. Most studies show that the G factor accounts for about 40 to 50% of the variability between subjects on IQ tests. And it seems that G is highly heritable. It can predict with fairly decent accuracy how well a child will do in school and how far they'll get in their careers. And it correlates with total brain volume, though only moderately so. That means that a significant portion of the variability in this general intelligence factor has in fact nothing to do with the size of your brain. Height, by the way, is also associated with G, as is myopia. Yep, you heard that correctly. Tall, bespectacled nerds are smarter on average than their eagle-eyed, shorter friends, well, at least according to IQ tests. Bad eyesight correlates with book learning. So yes, taller people might be smarter on average given their bigger brains. But, you might be thinking, nerds are by definition not so good with the social skills. Don't those need to be considered? Once the G factor was suggested and fairly widely accepted, it was further divided into two types: fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. You can think of them as the difference between quick thinking and wisdom. Fluid intelligence peaks in your 20s, while crystallized intelligence remains steady or steadily increases throughout adulthood, depending on how you use your brain. But despite the evidence for the existence of a G factor, whether fluid or crystallized, not all psychologists are happy with the notion that there is one major underlying ability. Probably the most famous challenge to G is Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. Here, we start considering the soft skills, like social graces, that might not be captured on traditional IQ tests. In this theory, Gardner suggests that there is no single factor, but that intelligence comes in many kinds, including musical intelligence, visual spatial, verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, bodily kinesthetic, and so on. Gardner's theory caught on quickly, especially amongst educators who struggle with the concept of general intelligence as they watch students excel at some subjects and fail at others. But despite the intuitive attractiveness of the idea, the evidence supporting his theory is slim to non-existent. And Gardner himself has bristled against one of the ways in which his theory has been applied. Some educators use the theory of multiple intelligences to justify their classification of students by learning styles. These educators feel that students should be taught in accordance with their learning styles. Auditory learners should be taught orally, visual learners with visual aids, and so on. But the evidence doesn't support this notion. Studies of the efficacy of teaching students according to their learning styles have failed to find any effect, and have begun to show that the practice might even impede a child's success in school. Suffice it to say, then, that whether we're talking about the G factor or the theory of multiple intelligences, we still haven't nailed down exactly what trait we're pointing to when we call a person smart. Even so, there are geniuses among us, people who surely can be universally considered especially smart. For example, if you ask 10 random people who's the smartest person who ever lived, I bet that at least half of them will agree on Albert Einstein. So what if we looked at the question from another angle and just examined Einstein's brain? Surely that would help us determine how a smart person's brain differs from the average. Luckily for science, Einstein's brain was saved for postmortem analysis. You might think then, problem solved. Whatever makes Einstein's brain different is likely the seat of intelligence. Well, let's examine the evidence. Before his death, Einstein indicated that he wanted his entire body to be cremated. We have to assume he meant his brain too. But the pathologist who conducted the autopsy couldn't bring himself to discard what, besides his unruly hair, was most certainly Einstein's signature body part. He kept the brain preserved for 30 years. Then, a group of 4 scientists, one of whom was my neuroanatomy professor, got their hands on 4 different sections of the great mind. They poked and prodded these sections, gazed at them for hours under the microscope, and measured a number of variables, comparing those numbers to specimens they received from the brains of patients at the Veterans Administration Hospital, who had died, of course. Now, let's play a game that will help you remember the findings of the study. Let's first predict what the results might be. Let's say that the signature of intelligence in the brain follows the cliché, the more the merrier. In that case, what we typically think of as the stars of the brain, the talent, if you will, should be more numerous. These are the neurons, whose signals to each other are generally thought to be the content or software of the brain. But your brain isn't just made up of neurons. About half the cells in your brain are glial cells, which support the workings of the stars, the entourage in this metaphor. Glial cells provide the neurons with the basic necessities of life. They keep them structurally in place, they help them send signals to each other more quickly, they provide the food and beverage services. They ensure that the neurons themselves can concentrate on the task at hand, firing off, or not, that all-important signal. So what do you think Einstein's brain, at least those first sections of 4 different brain regions to be picked apart, showed? More glial cells or more neurons? A bigger entourage or more talent? Well, it turns out that at least in these regions, and at least compared with a certain cohort of war vets, Einstein's neurons had a bigger entourage, but there were fewer stars. That is, the ratio of neurons to glial cells was lower in Einstein's brain than in his VA counterparts. Ha, you might think. The seat of intelligence, then, is not in the number of neurons, but in their quality. They might need more support because they're busier, too busy sending all those important signals to worry about things like laundry and groceries. I mean, what big Hollywood star doesn't have a whole set of assistants to help them with the daily grind? But what if I told you that this ratio difference was only significant in one of the 4 brain sections studied, and that the researchers knew which slices belonged to Einstein and which belonged to the vets? So maybe they were unconsciously influenced to find a difference. All of a sudden, the finding doesn't seem so robust. What's more, there's another paper in which the lower neuron-glia ratio in the left parietal region is used as an explanation for Einstein's purported dyslexia. Here, the author argues that since lesions to this region can cause dyslexia, then the smaller number of neurons might have had the same effect in Einstein. So, while some papers claim that the lower ratio explains Einstein's intelligence, at least one other sees the ratio as the cause of a deficit. Taking another look at Einstein's brain, a different group of scientists got their hands on a section from his prefrontal cortex. Now, given that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for complex cognition, it would make sense that differences in this region might be more compelling if we're making a case for neuroanatomical differences accounting for Einstein's smarts. Here, they found that his cortex was thinner than that of controls, but that the neurons there were more densely packed. Now, in many studies, cortical thickness is taken to be a good thing, and aging and neurodegenerative diseases can cause cortical thinning. But undeterred by this fact, this group of scientists explained that the more densely packed neurons might have given Einstein an intellectual edge. Perhaps neurons that are so close together can communicate more quickly and efficiently with each other. Now, people with schizophrenia have also been shown to have more densely packed neurons in the prefrontal cortex. So, is all this beginning to sound a bit like grasping for straws? What's interesting to me about these studies is not necessarily the findings themselves, but the ways in which our tendency to look for evidence in line with our beliefs, the confirmation bias, seems to permeate all of the interpretations of the data. What if Einstein's brain, neuroanatomically speaking, just isn't that different from average? What can we conclude about the relationship between brain size and intelligence? Well, if overall size is not the answer, perhaps it's the composition of specific brain regions, those that are important for the types of thinking that IQ tests measure. And there are plenty of studies that have found correlations between different aspects of neuroanatomy and IQ test performance. Broadly speaking, these studies can be divided up into 2 types. Those that measure differences in gray matter, roughly translating into the number of neurons, and those that look for differences in white matter, or the connections between neurons. Gray matter in the frontal lobe does correlate with intelligence, as measured by IQ tests at least. Spatial tasks like rotating an object in your mind's eye and matching it to a set of 2D options, or figuring out which object represents the next one in a series, verbal tests like finding the similarities in a sequence of letters, and so on. These are all tasks that are thought to rely heavily on the G factor, and they all seem to activate or rely on a set of brain regions in the front of the brain. Apparently, the more gray matter in these regions, the better the performance on these particular tasks. And there's evidence from patients with brain damage or deterioration of gray matter in the frontal cortex that demonstrates how important this region is when it comes to behaving intelligently. Patients with damage to the region tend to show poor performance on intelligence tests and make poor decisions in daily life. So maybe size does matter when it comes to the frontal lobes, though as you can already tell, the story is pretty complicated. It gets even more murky when we start to consider that the frontal cortex doesn't act in a vacuum and that the real work of the brain happens between neurons, not within them. This is where white matter comes in. White matter represents the connections between neurons, and it's called white because under a microscope, when it's been fixed with formaldehyde, the fatty sheath that covers axons, these are the wires that carry the signal away from brain cells, looks white. How much white matter you have might be an indicator of how well and how quickly your neurons can communicate with each other. Scientists who study the relationship between white matter and intelligence say that they are investigating the neural correlates of quick thinking. The idea is that a person with more white matter does, in fact, think more quickly than someone with impoverished connectivity. And the faster speed of thinking then translates into greater intelligence. And indeed, we can find correlations between the amount of white matter a person has and how they score on intelligence tests. The corpus callosum, which is the largest tract of white matter in the brain, connects the left and the right hemispheres. And a larger callosum correlates with better performance on a range of cognitive tests, though not all measures of callosal volume have shown statistically significant effects. So some neuroscientists take this mixed evidence as suggestive of the idea that gray matter may be more important when it comes to defining the neural basis of intelligence. One shortcoming that all of the above-mentioned studies have in common, though, is the fact that we still don't have a great definition of intelligence. And when we step back for a moment and think about what we're actually trying to explain, the types of tasks used in many of these studies just don't seem to capture much of what it really means to be smart. Maybe intelligence is related to how much gray matter we have in the frontal cortex. Maybe also the connectivity between brain regions makes a difference. But what's becoming more and more clear is that a bigger brain doesn't necessarily lead to more intelligence. And as Einstein's brain demonstrates, a smaller than average brain can yield some pretty amazing insights. There's one more myth related to the size matters question that is worth considering, if just for a moment. You might have heard that there lived a type of hominid that walked around 10 to 30,000 years ago in southern Africa, with a much larger brain than ours. If that sounds at all familiar, you might have come across the Boskop myth, or some version of it. Proponents of the myth point to the discovery of pieces of a skull in 1913 by a couple of farmers near the village of Boskop, South Africa. Similar skulls were soon found nearby by paleontologists. Then, in 2008, two neuroscientists, Gary Lynch and Richard Granger, published a popular book called Big Brain: The Origins and Future of Human Intelligence. In the book, they suggest that Boskop man had a larger brain and frontal cortex in particular, which might have provided him with a superior IQ. There's something exciting about the idea that there once lived a race of super smart hominids who, for one reason or another, went extinct. We see versions of this type of myth in many different cultures, and the discovery of rather large skulls feeds into these fantasies. So the media picked up this tidbit and ran with it. But the truth is that paleontologists and anthropologists largely dismiss the notion. While the Boskop skulls were on the larger side, they don't seem to be significantly different from our own, or more precisely, from the Khoikhoi people who lived in the region. The field of paleontology put this particular myth to bed way back in the 1950s. Our desire, or even our existential need to place our species on a special pedestal, a particularly marvelous branch of the tree of life, often clouds our interpretation of the data. We use evolution to explain so much of biology, and yet when it comes to understanding ourselves, we often resort to insisting that we are some kind of exception. Our brains are bigger than our body size would suggest, or we have more connections between our neurons, or more neurons in our cortex. But why do we need to think of ourselves as outliers in the evolutionary path? Does it make us any less human if we're simply the logical next branch in the primate family tree? Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Huzel doesn't think so. She has devised a way of counting the cells in the brain that has called into question the very idea that our brains are special. In fact, she argues that the endurance of the encephalization quotient might have more to do with confirmation bias than with any real evidence, since it's the one measure of intelligence that makes our species an outlier. It might not be that we have bigger brains compared with our primate cousins, but that they have bigger bodies than we do. That is, maybe we didn't evolve bigger brains, maybe our primate cousins evolved bigger bodies, but their brains stayed the same size, or maybe even got a little smaller. We've heard it said that we have the biggest brains in the animal kingdom. We don't. And what Susana Herculano Huzel has shown is that larger brains don't even necessarily mean more neurons. Let's start with rodents. As rodent brains increase in size, they don't just add more neurons. The neurons themselves get bigger. Like, as a baby grows, she doesn't grow more arms. The ones she has get bigger. But in primates, the neurons don't really grow in size with bigger brains. They do actually add more neurons. A primate brain that is the same size as a rodent brain will contain many more neurons. Given that we're primates and not rodents, Herculano Huzel then devised a model that predicts how many neurons and support cells a primate brain of a certain size should contain. And her model predicts that if we were just the logical next step on the evolutionary path, our brains should contain about 93 billion neurons and about 112 billion glial or support cells. So are we off the charts? Nope. The average human brain has about 86 billion neurons and 85 billion non-neuronal cells. Even the ratio of cerebral cortex to the rest of the brain matches up with predictions based on our primate cousins. Hardly a star pupil. Definitely not a citizen of Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. What's interesting is that our primate cousins, the great apes, have smaller brains than their body size would predict. Why? Because neurons are gas guzzlers. They're expensive from an energy use perspective. And gorillas and chimpanzees simply can't get enough fuel from their food to power more brain cells than they have. We're coming full circle here, and once again finding that food might explain why babies are born with small brains. So why can we handle these big brains? Perhaps because we figured out how to cook. And cooking our food freed up time to do all the other things that ultimately have shaped our brains into the sophisticated thinking machines that they are today. We developed a cortex, the newest part of the brain, and where functions like decision-making and social interactions, language, music, imagination are located, that contains more neurons than any other species we've studied. Herculano Huzel's work puts the nail in the coffin of the idea that it's brain size or the encephalization quotient that matters. But her work does help us answer the question of what makes us special. Now that we can get all the calories we need from cooked food, we can spend time shaping our average primate brains into the powerful thinking machines that can write poetry, build spaceships, become civilized, cure disease. But Herculano Huzel cautions against applying this method to predict the number of neurons individuals in a species might possess. Her own work has shown that intraspecies variability in the density of neurons is considerable, and that it doesn't correlate strongly with brain size. So we can't conclude that someone with a bigger brain has more neurons, as Einstein's brain beautifully demonstrates. It's not the size that matters, but how you use it. Or rather, how your experience has shaped it, and how it is that you spend all of your time.